Close your eyes and imagine the sound of rain against stone windows in a fortress by the sea. Picture candlelight flickering against maps spread across mahogany tables, casting dancing shadows of kingdoms and continents. Feel the weight of a crown that was never meant to rest easy on any mortal head. Tonight, we journey into the life of a man who reshaped the very soul of Europe. A Corsican boy who became an emperor, a dreamer who built an empire with his bare hands, only to watch it crumble like sand through his fingers. His name echoes through history like thunder across mountains. Napoleon Bonaparte. But before we begin this journey through time and memory, if you find yourself drawn to these stories of the past, these whispered tales of emperors and dreamers, consider subscribing to our channel. Leave a comment below and tell us what other fascinating souls from history you'd love to hear about in the gentle hours before sleep. Now, dim the lights. Let the world outside fade away. Close your eyes and listen. Let your breathing slow as we step back through the mists of time, back to when the fate of nations hung in the balance and one man's ambition burned like a star across the darkness of history. The story begins. In the Mediterranean, where the sea meets the sky in endless shades of blue, there lies an island called Corsica. Picture it rising from the waves like a sleeping giant, its mountains cloaked in morning mist, its shores kissed by waters that have carried the dreams of civilizations for thousands of years. It was here, in the town of Ajaccio, that our story begins on a summer day in 1769. The air was thick with the scent of wild herbs and salt spray, and somewhere in a modest stone house, a child was born who would one day make the earth tremble beneath his feet. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, though the world would come to know him by another name entirely. He arrived in this world just as his homeland was being torn from one empire and delivered to another. For Corsica, that jewel of the Mediterranean had just been sold by the Republic of Genoa to the Kingdom of France. The boy was born between two worlds, between two loyalties, carrying within him the restless spirit of an island that had never quite belonged to anyone. Feel the Mediterranean breeze that would have touched his infant face, carrying with it the whispers of ancient empires, Roman legions marching across distant shores, Venetian merchants counting coins in shadowed alcoves, and somewhere in the distance, the eternal rhythm of waves against stone that had lulled countless generations to sleep. His father, Charles Bonaparte, was a lawyer with dreams larger than his modest means, a man who moved through the corridors of power like a shadow, seeking favor, seeking advantage for his growing family. His mother, Letizia, was a woman carved from the very stone of Corsica itself. Strong, unyielding, beautiful in the way that ancient statues are beautiful, with eyes that held the wisdom of mountains and the fury of storms. Young Napoleon grew up in a house where French and Italian mingled like lovers in the evening air, where the politics of three nations were discussed over simple meals of bread and wine. He was a strange child, this boy who would become emperor, small for his age, with dark hair that caught the light like raven wings, and eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond his years. The cobblestone streets of Ajaccio became his first battlefield. Here, among the narrow alleys and sun-drenched squares, he learned the art of war through the eternal conflicts of childhood. He would gather the local boys around him, dividing them into armies, leading them in elaborate campaigns against invisible enemies. Even then, there was something different about him, a magnetism that drew others to follow, a voice that commanded attention even when it cracked with youth. In the evenings, when the Mediterranean sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, young Napoleon would climb to the highest point in Ajaccio and gaze out across the water. What did he see in those endless horizons? Perhaps the sails of ships carrying stories from distant lands, or the reflection of stars that had watched over Caesar and Alexander. Perhaps even then he sensed that his destiny lay somewhere beyond the shores of his beloved island. The house was filled with books, precious volumes that his father had collected, works of history and philosophy that spoke of great men and greater deeds. By candlelight, the boy would lose himself in tales of ancient Rome, of generals who crossed rivers with their armies, of emperors who reshaped the world with their will. The words became his companions, the heroes his teachers, and slowly, quietly, an ambition began to grow within him like a seed in fertile soil. But Corsica was small, and the Bonaparte family's fortunes were smaller still. Charles knew that his son's future lay beyond the island's shores, in the courts and academies of France. And so, when Napoleon was just 9 years old, arrangements were made. The boy would leave his Mediterranean paradise, leave the warmth of his mother's embrace and the familiar rhythms of island life to attend military school in the cold foreign land of France. Picture that final morning in Ajaccio, the mist rising from the harbor, the fishing boats returning with their silver catch, the church bells chiming the hour across the sleeping town. Somewhere in that modest stone house, a mother was saying goodbye to her son, not knowing that she was releasing a force that would reshape the world. The ship that carried him away from Corsica might have been just another vessel in the endless procession of Mediterranean commerce, but it carried within its hold a destiny that would echo through the ages. As the island grew smaller behind him, as the familiar mountains faded into memory, Napoleon Bonaparte was already becoming something new, no longer just a Corsican boy, but a citizen of a larger world, a world of infinite possibility and equally infinite danger. The sea stretched endlessly before him, and somewhere beyond the horizon France waited, that great nation of revolutions and kings, of cathedrals and battlefields, where a boy from a small island would learn to dream of empire. The military academy of Brienne stands like a fortress against the French countryside, its stone walls weathered by centuries of Norman reign and the dreams of countless young soldiers. Picture it in the depth of winter, when frost covers the parade grounds like powdered glass, and the breath of cadets mixes with the morning mist in ghostly clouds. It was here, in this ancient institution, that the island boy began his transformation. The France of the 1780s was a nation on the edge of a precipice, though few realized it yet. The old world of kings and courtiers still glittered in its golden chambers, but beneath the surface, currents of change were stirring like underground rivers seeking the light. Napoleon arrived at Brienne speaking French with the thick accent of Corsica, his pronunciation marking him as an outsider among the sons of French nobility. He was small even for his age, with the olive skin of the Mediterranean that stood out starkly against the pale complexions of his classmates. They mocked him, these boys with their ancient names and inherited pride, calling him the little Corsican, never imagining that one day he would hold their ancestral lands in the palm of his hand. But mockery only fed the fire that burned within him. In the cold dormitories of Brienne, while other boys wrote letters home complaining of the harsh discipline, Napoleon devoured books. By candlelight, when the academy slept, he would read of Caesar's campaigns, of Alexander's conquests, of the great captains who had bent history to their will. The words became part of him, each strategy memorized, each battle refought in the theater of his imagination. His mathematics teacher, Brother Louis, would later remember the intensity in those dark eyes as Napoleon worked through problems of trajectory and siege warfare. He approached each equation, the old monk would recall, as if the fate of nations depended upon its solution, and perhaps in some strange way it did. The seasons turned at Brienne like pages in an ancient book. Spring brought the scent of apple blossoms and the sound of drilling soldiers, summer the drowsy heat of afternoon studies, autumn the crackle of leaves and the first hints of winter's approach. And through it all Napoleon grew, not in stature, for he would always be small, but in knowledge, in ambition, in the quiet confidence that comes to those who discover they possess gifts that others lack. He excelled in mathematics and history, finding in numbers and dates the patterns that would serve him well in the geometry of battle. His fellow students saw him as strange, solitary, too serious for a boy of his age. While they played at cards and spoke of hunting and fashion, he drew maps of imaginary campaigns, positioning armies of toy soldiers in elaborate formations that made perfect sense to him and seemed like madness to others. The years at Brienne passed like a dream within a dream. In 1784, he was selected to attend the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, that jewel of French military education where the sons of the greatest families learned the art of war. He was 15 years old, still carrying the accent of Corsica, still bearing the olive complexion that marked him as foreign, but now armed with knowledge and a growing sense of his own destiny. Paris in the 1780s was a city of contrasts as sharp as the blade of a sword. The wealthy districts glittered with silk and gold, while the poor quarters stank of desperation and decay. The streets buzzed with ideas, dangerous ideas about liberty and equality, about the rights of man and the divine right of kings. Coffee houses hummed with revolutionary talk, and pamphlets circulated like autumn leaves in the wind. At the École Militaire, Napoleon studied artillery, the science of thunder and lightning made manifest in bronze and steel. He learned to calculate the parabolic arc of cannonballs, to position guns for maximum effect, to understand the terrible mathematics of destruction. His instructors noted his exceptional ability, his uncanny intuition for the battlefield, his capacity to see patterns where others saw only chaos. But it was not just military science that occupied his mind. Paris was a library of infinite size, and he wandered through its intellectual districts like a starving man at a feast. He read Rousseau and Voltaire, absorbed the ideas of the Enlightenment, and began to understand that the world was not fixed and eternal, but malleable, subject to the will of those bold enough to reshape it. In his sparse quarters at the academy, he would sit by the window and watch the city spread out below him like a map of human ambition. Somewhere in those twisting streets, revolution was brewing. The old certainties were crumbling like ancient parchment, and from their ashes, new possibilities were emerging. He graduated from the École Militaire in 1785, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery. He was 16 years old, armed with mathematics and dreams, ready to enter a world that was about to explode into chaos. But first, he would return to Corsica, to the island of his birth, to say goodbye to the boy he had been, and to prepare for the man he was destined to become. The ship that carried him back across the Mediterranean bore not just a young officer, but a mind shaped by French learning and Corsican pride, a heart filled with the poetry of ancient conquests and the practical knowledge of modern warfare. As the familiar mountains of Corsica rose from the blue waters, Napoleon Bonaparte was already something new, no longer just an island boy, but a citizen of a larger world, a world on the brink of transformation. And in the years that followed, as France convulsed in revolution and the old order crumbled like sandcastles before the tide, he would discover that he was not just a witness to history, but one of its architects, ready to build from the rubble of the past a future that would bear his name for centuries to come. Picture France in the year 1793, a nation consuming itself like a serpent, devouring its own tail. The elegant salons of Versailles have given way to the thunderous roar of the guillotine, and the streets of Paris run red with the blood of kings and commoners alike. In this chaos, in this terrible birth of a new world, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte would find his destiny. The revolution had swept across France like a forest fire, consuming everything in its path. The old certainties, crown, altar, and nobility, had been reduced to ash and memory. In their place rose something unprecedented, a republic built on the radical notion that all men were created equal, that governments derived their power from the people, not from God or tradition. But revolutions, like storms, are difficult to control. The moderate voices that had begun the transformation were soon drowned out by more radical elements, and France found itself governed by terror. The Committee of Public Safety, led by the incorruptible Maximilien Robespierre, wielded the guillotine like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away what they saw as the diseased tissue of the old regime. Into this maelstrom stepped Napoleon, no longer the awkward boy from Corsica, but a man of 24, his mind sharpened by years of study and his heart hardened by the realities of revolutionary France. He had spent the early years of the revolution in relative obscurity, serving in various artillery positions, watching as the world he had known crumbled around him. His moment came in the autumn of 1793 in the port city of Toulon. The city, crucial to French naval power, had fallen to the British and their royalist allies. The revolutionary government, desperate to reclaim this vital stronghold, had assembled an army to retake it. But their siege had stalled, bogged down in the complex mathematics of fortress warfare. Napoleon arrived at Toulon like a summer storm after a long drought. He surveyed the situation with the cool calculation of a chess master, seeing not just the present position, but the entire game stretching into the future. The other officers had been thinking in terms of traditional siege warfare, but Napoleon saw a different path, one that would require audacity, precision, and perfect timing. He positioned his cannons not where convention dictated, but where mathematics demanded. He calculated trajectories with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker, understanding that each shot must be not just accurate, but devastatingly effective. His battery, positioned on a hill overlooking the harbor, would be nicknamed La Batterie des Hommes sans peur, the battery of men without fear. The bombardment began at dawn, and the sound echoed across the Mediterranean like the voice of a new god. Napoleon's guns, positioned with mathematical precision, poured fire into the British fleet and the city's defenses. The enemy, caught off guard by the unconventional tactics, found themselves unable to respond effectively. Within days, Toulon fell. The British fleet, bloodied and broken, limped away across the waves, and the tricolour of the Republic once again flew over the city's walls. Napoleon, the young artillery officer who had planned the victory, found himself promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. More importantly, he had tasted the intoxicating nectar of military success. But the revolution was far from over. The terror continued to consume France, and even Napoleon found himself briefly imprisoned when political winds shifted. In a dank cell in the Fort Carré, he had time to contemplate the capricious nature of revolutionary justice. Power, he realized, was not given but taken, not inherited but earned through superior force and will. The fall of Robespierre in 1794 ended the terror, but it also left France in a state of exhaustion and uncertainty. The revolution had devoured its own children, and the surviving leaders sought stability above all else. A new government emerged, the Directory, corrupt, weak, and increasingly unpopular with the people who had grown weary of chaos. Napoleon, now in his late 20s, found himself assigned to the Army of Italy, a force that had been neglected and demoralized by years of inconclusive warfare. The soldiers under his command were ragged, unpaid, and dispirited. Their enemies, the Austrians and their allies, controlled much of northern Italy and seemed confident in their superiority. What happened next would echo through the halls of history like thunder through a mountain pass. Napoleon took command of the army of Italy in March 1796, and within months he had transformed it from a collection of demoralized units into a force that would redraw the map of Europe. His strategy was deceptively simple: speed, concentration, and the ability to strike where the enemy least expected. He moved his troops like a chess master moving pieces, always thinking several moves ahead, always seeking the decisive moment when superior force could be brought to bear at the crucial point. The battles came in rapid succession: Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, Mondovi, each victory feeding the next, each success building the legend of the young general who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of warfare. His soldiers, who had begun by calling him Le Petit Caporal and the Little Corporal, now followed him with the devotion of disciples following a prophet. In the evening, after the guns had fallen silent and the wounded had been tended, Napoleon would sit in his tent and write letters to Josephine, the woman who had captured his heart. His words, penned by candlelight, revealed a different side of the conquering general, passionate, romantic, almost desperately in love with a woman who remained tantalizingly distant. "I wake filled with thoughts of you," he wrote. "Your portrait and the intoxicating evening which we spent yesterday have left my senses in turmoil. Sweet, incomparable Josephine, what a strange effect you have on my heart." But even as he wrote of love, his mind was calculating the next campaign, the next battle, the next step in his inexorable rise to power. The revolution had created a vacuum, and like all vacuums, it would eventually be filled. Napoleon, perhaps more than anyone, understood that the age of kings was ending, but the age of emperors was about to begin. Listen, can you hear it? The sound of cavalry hooves on cobblestones, the jingle of sabers, the distant rumble of artillery being pulled through mountain passes by teams of straining horses. This is the music of Napoleon's first great symphony, the Italian campaign that would announce to the world that a new force had entered the stage of history. Picture the army of Italy as Napoleon found it in the spring of 1796. Imagine soldiers in tattered uniforms, their boots worn through, their faces gaunt from hunger and months of unpaid service. They had been fighting a desultory war against the Austrians and their allies, achieving nothing, going nowhere, slowly dissolving into indiscipline and despair. Into this scene of military decay stepped a young general of 26, small in stature, but carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had read every military treatise ever written and understood warfare as both art and science. His first address to his troops has echoed through history like a bell tolling the birth of a new age. "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power." These were not the words of a traditional general speaking to his troops, but of a revolutionary promising his followers a new world. And within weeks, those promises would begin to take flesh. The campaign began with a stroke of genius so audacious that it would be studied in military academies for centuries to come. The Austrian and Piedmontese armies, confident in their numerical superiority, had positioned themselves to crush the French between them like grain in a mill. But Napoleon saw their plan as if it were written in starlight across the sky. He moved his army with the speed of Mercury, striking first at the Piedmontese at Montenotte, then wheeling like a dancer to smash the Austrians at Millesimo. In 5 days, he had defeated both enemy forces separately, turning their numerical advantage into a fatal weakness. The other generals watched in amazement as he demonstrated a principle that would become his signature: the concentration of superior force at the decisive point. But it was not just tactics that made Napoleon's campaign so revolutionary. He had understood something that the old generals, trained in the rigid traditions of 18th century warfare, had missed entirely. War was no longer the exclusive province of professional soldiers fighting for abstract dynastic claims. The revolution had unleashed new forces: nationalism, ideology, the passion of peoples fighting for their beliefs. And these forces required new methods, new strategies, new approaches to the ancient art of battle. His soldiers began to fight not just for pay or plunder, but for the intoxicating dream of glory. They saw in their young general something that transcended the mundane realities of military life, a vision of themselves as the instruments of destiny, the bearers of revolutionary ideals to the benighted peoples of Europe. The victories came in rapid succession, each one feeding the legend, each success building upon the last. At Lodi, Napoleon personally sighted the cannons that swept the Austrian rearguard from the bridge, earning from his soldiers the nickname Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal who was not too proud to handle a gun himself. As the summer of 1796 ripened into autumn, Napoleon's army swept across the plains of Lombardy like a liberating wind. Milan opened its gates without a shot being fired, and the young general entered the city in triumph, his soldiers marching to the rhythm of revolutionary songs while crowds threw flowers from the windows of palaces that had sheltered kings and emperors. But Napoleon was learning that conquest was only the beginning. Governing required different skills than fighting, and the complex politics of Italy demanded a subtlety that pure military force could not provide. He negotiated with princes and cardinals, balanced competing factions, and slowly began to understand that true power lay not just in winning battles, but in shaping the peace that followed. The campaign that had begun as a simple military operation was becoming something far more complex, a laboratory for the ideas and methods that would later reshape Europe. Napoleon was not just conquering territory. He was experimenting with new forms of government, new relationships between ruler and ruled, new ways of organizing society. His letters from this period reveal a mind grappling with questions that went far beyond military strategy. How do you govern a conquered people? How do you balance the demands of revolution with the necessities of administration? How do you transform an army of liberation into an instrument of enduring power? The answers would come gradually, through trial and error, through the painful process of learning that ideals, however pure, must be adapted to the messy realities of human nature and political necessity. But even as he struggled with these questions, Napoleon was discovering within himself capacities that he had never suspected, not just for war, but for governance, for diplomacy, for the thousand subtle arts of wielding power. The Italian campaign reached its climax in the autumn of 1796 with the siege of Mantua, that ancient fortress city that controlled the route between Austria and northern Italy. For months the siege dragged on, with Napoleon's forces fighting not just the garrison within the walls, but repeated Austrian attempts to relieve the city. Each relief attempt was defeated with the same mathematical precision that had characterized the entire campaign. Napoleon moved his forces like a conductor directing a symphony, each movement calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste. His enemies, trained in the older methods of warfare, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. When Mantua finally fell in February 1797, it marked not just the end of Austrian power in northern Italy, but the birth of a new kind of warfare, faster, more decisive, more attuned to the political realities of the revolutionary age. Napoleon had proven that a small, well-led force could defeat much larger armies through superior strategy, better tactics, and the intangible force of revolutionary enthusiasm. But perhaps more importantly, the Italian campaign had revealed Napoleon to himself. He had discovered that he possessed not just military talent, but the far rarer gift of inspiring men to transcend their limitations. to achieve things they had never thought possible. He had learned that power, properly wielded, could reshape not just the outcome of battles, but the very nature of the world itself. As the campaign drew to a close, Napoleon found himself master of northern Italy, the conqueror of Austria's armies, the hero of the French Republic. But he was also something more, a man who had glimpsed the possibilities that lay beyond the conventional boundaries of ambition, who had tasted the intoxicating nectar of shaping history rather than simply participating in it. The Italian campaign had been his first symphony, and it had been played to perfection. But even as the applause of victory echoed across Europe, Napoleon was already hearing the opening notes of a grander composition, one that would span continents and reshape the very foundations of civilization. Close your eyes and imagine the Mediterranean as it was in the summer of 1798, a sea of ancient dreams and modern ambitions, where the ghosts of Alexander's conquests still whispered across waters that had carried the ships of pharaohs and Caesars. Somewhere on those wine-dark waters, a fleet of unprecedented size was cutting through the waves, carrying within its holds not just an army, but a vision of empire that would stretch from the pyramids to the palaces of France. This was Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, perhaps the most romantic and improbable chapter in his extraordinary life. To understand why a young general at the height of his European success would turn his eyes toward the land of the pharaohs, we must first understand the mind that conceived such an audacious dream. Napoleon had returned from his Italian triumphs as the most celebrated soldier in France, but celebrity, he was beginning to discover, was a double-edged sword. The Directory, the corrupt and ineffective government that ruled France, viewed his popularity with the same suspicion that medieval kings had reserved for overly successful generals. They needed his talents, but they feared his ambition. The solution, when it came, satisfied everyone's immediate needs while serving Napoleon's longer-term vision. France's eastern trade routes had been disrupted by British naval power, and the nation's merchants clamored for access to the wealth of India and the Orient. Why not, suggested the young general, strike at Britain's most valuable possession by conquering Egypt and using it as a stepping stone to India? It was a plan that appealed to the romantic imagination as much as to cold strategic calculation. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the birthplace of ancient wisdom, the crossroads where Africa met Asia, and the Mediterranean world encountered the mysteries of the East. What general, especially one who had devoured the histories of Alexander and Caesar, could resist such a prize? The expedition that sailed from Toulon in May 1798 was unlike any that had left European shores. Napoleon had assembled not just soldiers but scholars, mathematicians, linguists, archaeologists, botanists, astronomers, an entire academy of learning intended to unlock the secrets of this ancient land. He envisioned not just conquest, but a marriage of French revolutionary ideals with the timeless wisdom of the East. The fleet itself was a marvel of organization and ambition. Nearly 400 ships carried 38,000 soldiers, sailors and civilians across the Mediterranean toward an uncertain destiny. On the flagship L'Orient, Napoleon spent the long hours of the voyage in his cabin, reading everything he could find about Egypt, absorbing the accounts of ancient historians and modern travelers, preparing his mind for the challenges that lay ahead. The landing at Alexandria in July 1798 was the stuff of legend. The ancient city, once the jewel of the Hellenistic world, had fallen into decay under Ottoman rule, but its harbor still echoed with the memories of Cleopatra's galleys and the lighthouse that had guided ships for 1,000 years. Napoleon's soldiers, many of whom had never seen anything more exotic than the Italian countryside, found themselves confronted by a world that seemed to have stepped out of the pages of the Bible. The first battle, fought in the shadow of the pyramids themselves, would become one of the most famous in military history. The Mameluke cavalry, those legendary warriors who had ruled Egypt for centuries, charged across the desert in a cloud of dust and steel, their curved swords flashing in the merciless sun. They were magnificent, these horsemen of the desert, proud inheritors of a martial tradition that stretched back to the Crusades. But they were also representatives of a military system that belonged to another age. Napoleon's soldiers, formed in solid squares bristling with bayonets, received the cavalry charges with the disciplined volleys that had made European armies masters of the battlefield. The encounter was brief but decisive. Within hours, the Mameluke army was broken, and the road to Cairo lay open. It was before this battle that Napoleon delivered one of his most famous speeches, gesturing toward the ancient monuments that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you from the summit of these pyramids." The words captured perfectly the sense of historical drama that Napoleon understood so well. The feeling that his soldiers were not just fighting for territory or plunder, but participating in the eternal human struggle for glory and remembrance. Cairo, when it fell, proved to be a revelation. This great city, the largest in the Islamic world, was a treasure house of learning and culture that had preserved the wisdom of centuries. Napoleon established himself in a palace that had once sheltered sultans and caliphs, and set about the complex task of governing a population whose language, religion, and customs were utterly foreign to European experience. But it was here, in the coffee houses and madrasas of Cairo, that Napoleon began to develop the ideas that would later shape his approach to empire. He saw how the Ottoman system had combined military efficiency with religious tolerance, how diverse populations could be welded into a functioning whole through skilled administration and respect for local customs. These lessons would serve him well in the years to come. The scholars who had accompanied the expedition began their monumental work of cataloguing and studying Egyptian civilization. They measured the pyramids, copied hieroglyphics, collected specimens of flora and fauna, and slowly began to piece together the puzzle of this ancient culture. Their work would culminate in the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, that key to understanding hieroglyphic writing that would unlock 3,000 years of Egyptian history. But the expedition was not without its disasters. Admiral Nelson's fleet had been hunting the French across the Mediterranean, and in August 1798, he found them anchored in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile, fought under the light of a full moon, was a catastrophe for French naval power. The flagship L'Orient exploded in a fireball that could be seen for miles, and with it died Napoleon's dreams of easy communication with France. Trapped in Egypt, cut off from reinforcement or retreat, Napoleon faced the greatest crisis of his career. Lesser men might have despaired, but he possessed the rare ability to transform setbacks into opportunities. If he could not return to France as a conqueror, he would make himself master of the East, the founder of a new empire that would rival those of Alexander and the Caesars. The Syrian campaign that followed was Napoleon's attempt to break out of his Egyptian prison by conquering the Ottoman Empire's Levantine provinces. It was a campaign that would test his generalship to its limits, leading his army across the Sinai Desert and into the ancient lands where Christ had walked and the Crusaders had fought their holy wars. The siege of Acre, that ancient fortress city that had defied the Crusaders and the Mongols, became Napoleon's first great military failure. The walls, strengthened by British engineers and defended by Ottoman janissaries, proved impregnable to his assault. For 2 months, his army battered themselves against the stone ramparts, while disease and exhaustion took their toll on his forces. The retreat from Acre marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's Oriental dreams. His army, decimated by plague and battle, staggered back across the desert toward Egypt, leaving behind the graves of thousands of soldiers who had followed their general into the furnace of the East. But even in failure, Napoleon had learned lessons that would shape his future. He had seen how empires could be built, not just through conquest, but through the patient work of administration and cultural synthesis. He had witnessed the power of propaganda and the importance of controlling the narrative of events. Most importantly, he had discovered that his destiny lay not in the East but in the heart of Europe, where the fate of the continent was being decided. The Egyptian expedition had been a dream, magnificent, audacious, and ultimately impossible. But dreams, even failed ones, have a way of shaping reality. The knowledge gained by his scholars would revolutionize European understanding of the ancient world, while the lessons learned by the general would inform the strategies that would soon make him master of Europe. As Napoleon prepared to abandon his Eastern Empire and return to France, he carried with him not just the memory of failure, but the seeds of a greater success. The desert had taught him that there were no limits to human ambition, only the boundaries that men imposed upon themselves. And those boundaries, he was beginning to understand, were far more flexible than most people imagined. Picture France in the autumn of 1799, a nation exhausted by a decade of revolution, its people yearning for stability after years of chaos and terror. The Directory, that corrupt and ineffective government that had emerged from the ashes of the Terror, was crumbling like a house built on sand. In the coffee houses of Paris, men spoke in whispers of the need for a strong hand, a leader who could restore order without destroying the gains of the revolution. Into this vacuum stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, returned from his Egyptian adventure with his reputation for military genius intact, despite the strategic failure of the campaign. He was 30 years old, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers, and he possessed something that France desperately needed: the ability to inspire confidence in a future that had seemed increasingly uncertain. The coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, was not a dramatic affair of charging cavalry and thundering cannons. It was instead a carefully orchestrated political maneuver, carried out by men who understood that revolutions, like theatrical performances, succeed or fail based on timing, preparation, and the ability to convince the audience that what they are witnessing is both inevitable and necessary. Napoleon's fellow conspirators included Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the abbé who had helped launch the revolution with his famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? And Roger Ducos, a politician whose moderate views had allowed him to survive the various purges of the revolutionary period. They were joined by Napoleon's brother Lucien, who held the crucial position of president of the Council of 500, the lower house of the Directory's legislature. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The legislature would be convinced to move from Paris to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, ostensibly for security reasons. There, away from the potentially hostile crowds of the capital, Napoleon would address the deputies and convince them to dissolve the Directory and establish a new government with himself at its head. But revolutions, even bloodless ones, rarely unfold according to plan. When Napoleon entered the chamber of the Council of 500, he found himself facing not the compliant audience he had expected, but a group of angry deputies who shouted accusations of treason and dictatorship. For a moment, the man who had faced Austrian cavalry and Mameluke warriors with perfect composure seemed to lose his nerve, stammering and pale under the verbal assault. It was his brother Lucien who saved the situation, ordering the guards to clear the chamber and allowing Napoleon to address the upper house, the Council of Ancients, where he found a more receptive audience. By evening, the coup was complete. The Directory was dissolved, and a new government, the Consulate, was established with Napoleon as first consul. The title was deliberately chosen to evoke memories of the Roman Republic, that ancient model of republican virtue that had inspired so many of the revolution's ideals. But those who knew Napoleon understood that this was merely the first step in a longer journey. The boy who had dreamed of Caesar and Alexander was now positioned to follow in their footsteps. The France that Napoleon inherited was a nation in desperate need of healing. 10 years of revolution had shattered the old certainties without creating stable new ones. The economy was in ruins, the currency worthless, the government bankrupt. Brigands controlled large swaths of the countryside, while the cities seethed with factions that viewed each other with murderous hatred. But Napoleon possessed something that previous revolutionary leaders had lacked: the ability to see beyond the immediate crisis to the underlying possibilities. Where others saw only chaos, he perceived the raw material for a new kind of state, one that would combine the democratic ideals of the revolution with the administrative efficiency of the old monarchy. His first priority was to make peace with the enemies of France. The Second Coalition, Austria, Britain, and Russia, had formed to contain the revolutionary contagion, and their armies threatened France from every direction. But Napoleon understood that military victories alone would not secure his position. He needed to convince the French people that he could provide not just glory, but prosperity and stability. The campaign that followed would become known as the Second Italian Campaign, and it would establish Napoleon's reputation as not just a gifted general, but a master of grand strategy. Crossing the Alps with an army of 40,000 men in May 1800, he achieved a feat that rivaled Hannibal's legendary passage centuries earlier. The image of Napoleon on horseback, his cloak billowing in the mountain wind as he led his army through the treacherous alpine passes, would become one of the most iconic in European art. Jacques-Louis David's painting of the scene captured not just a moment in military history, but the birth of a new kind of heroism, one that combined classical virtue with romantic individualism. The Battle of Marengo, fought on June 14, 1800, nearly ended Napoleon's career before it had truly begun. For most of the day, the Austrian army under General Melas held the advantage, and by afternoon, Napoleon was considering retreat. But in the evening, a desperate counterattack led by General Desire turned defeat into victory, though at the cost of Desire's life. Napoleon later admitted that Marengo had been the closest thing to a defeat that I ever experienced. But he also understood the importance of controlling the narrative of events. In his dispatches to Paris, the near disaster became a triumph of superior strategy and inspired leadership. The art of propaganda, which he had learned in Egypt, would become one of his most powerful weapons. The victory at Marengo secured Napoleon's position as first consul and allowed him to turn his attention to the monumental task of rebuilding France. What followed was a period of reform that would reshape not just French society, but the entire European conception of government and law. The Concordat of 1801, negotiated with Pope Pius VII, ended the bitter conflict between the Revolution and the Catholic Church that had torn France apart for a decade. Napoleon understood that the vast majority of French people remained Catholic in their hearts, despite the revolutionary attempts to create a new civic religion. By making peace with Rome while maintaining the revolution's principle of religious freedom, he healed one of the deepest wounds in French society. But it was the creation of the Civil Code, later known as the Code Napoleon, that would prove to be his most enduring legacy. This comprehensive legal framework, which combined elements of Roman law, French customary law, and revolutionary principles, would eventually be adopted by dozens of countries around the world. Its emphasis on equality before the law, protection of property rights, and civil liberties created a legal foundation for the modern world. Working 18-hour days in his study at the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon personally participated in the discussions that shaped every article of the code. His practical intelligence, combined with his understanding of both human nature and social necessity, produced a legal framework that was both idealistic and pragmatic, revolutionary and conservative. The establishment of the Legion of Honor in 1802 reflected Napoleon's understanding that people needed more than material rewards to inspire their best efforts. The revolution had abolished the old nobility, but human nature demanded recognition for merit and achievement. The Legion of Honor, open to all citizens regardless of birth, created a new aristocracy based on service to the state. As the consulate evolved, it became increasingly clear that Napoleon was not content to remain merely the first among equals. Each crisis, each success, each demonstration of his indispensability to the French state brought him closer to the throne that he had never explicitly sought but had always secretly desired. The discovery of royalist plots against his life provided the justification for increasingly authoritarian measures. The execution of the Duke of Enghien in 1804, a young Bourbon prince whose only crime was his bloodline, shocked Europe but sent a clear message. The old dynasty was dead and a new one was being born. On May 18, 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French. The title was carefully chosen, not Emperor of France, which would have suggested a return to the old monarchy, but Emperor of the French, implying that his authority derived from the people themselves. The coronation ceremony, held in Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2, 1804, was a masterpiece of political theatre. Napoleon, in a gesture that captured perfectly his relationship to both tradition and revolution, took the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. He would not, even in the moment of his greatest triumph, allow anyone else to be the source of his authority. As the cathedral bells rang out across Paris, announcing the birth of a new empire, those who witnessed the ceremony understood that they were present at one of history's great turning points. The revolution that had begun with the modest goal of reforming the monarchy had produced something unprecedented. An emperor whose authority derived not from divine right or hereditary claim, but from his own extraordinary abilities and the consent of the governed. The boy from Corsica had become the master of France, but his ambitions reached far beyond the borders of his adopted homeland. As he stood in Notre Dame, the crown of Charlemagne heavy on his brow, Napoleon Bonaparte was already dreaming of an empire that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Urals, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The consulate was ending, but the empire was just beginning. And with it would come glories and disasters that would reshape the very foundations of European civilization. In the depths of winter, when the first snows of December 1805 blanketed the rolling hills of Moravia, two great armies faced each other across a landscape that seemed carved from silver and shadow. Here on the plains near the village of Austerlitz, Napoleon would fight what he would later call the most beautiful of all my battles, a contest that would establish him as the greatest military genius of his age and reshape the balance of power in Europe. Picture the emperor as he stood on the heights of the Pratzen Plateau in the hour before dawn, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. At 36, Napoleon had reached the full flowering of his powers, his mind sharp as a Toledo blade, his confidence absolute, his understanding of warfare so complete that he could read the intentions of his enemies as clearly as if they had written them in the stars. The Third Coalition had formed against him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Austria and Russia, humiliated by his previous victories, had joined with Britain in a new attempt to contain the revolutionary emperor who threatened to overturn the ancient order of Europe. Their armies, commanded by emperors and grand dukes who traced their lineage back to Charlemagne, considered themselves the natural leaders of Christendom, against this upstart Corsican. But Napoleon had spent months preparing for this confrontation, and he approached it with the methodical patience of a chess master contemplating his final combination. He had drawn his enemies into a trap so subtle that they had helped to construct it themselves, believing all the while that they were the hunters rather than the hunted. The French army that marched across Europe to meet this coalition was the finest military instrument that Napoleon had yet created. These were the soldiers of the Grande Armée, veterans of a dozen campaigns, bound together by shared hardships and common triumphs. They followed their emperor not merely out of duty, but with the fierce devotion that men reserve for leaders who have proven themselves capable of the impossible. The march from the Channel coast, where Napoleon had been preparing for an invasion of Britain, to the battlefields of Central Europe, was a masterpiece of military logistics. Nearly 200,000 men moved across the continent with the precision of clockwork, each corps following routes calculated to achieve maximum surprise and concentration at the crucial moment. The Austrians, commanded by General Mack, had advanced into Bavaria, expecting to link up with their Russian allies. Instead, they found themselves surrounded at Ulm by French forces that seemed to have materialized out of thin air. The capitulation of 30,000 Austrian troops without a significant battle was a strategic catastrophe that left the road to Vienna open to Napoleon's advancing columns. But it was at Austerlitz that the emperor would demonstrate the full extent of his genius. The Allied army, 85,000 Austrians and Russians commanded by Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis II, held a strong position on the Pratzen Heights. Their plan was sound in principle: attack the French right wing, roll up Napoleon's line and cut off his retreat toward Vienna. Napoleon, however, had anticipated this strategy with the clarity of a prophet. He deliberately weakened his right wing, making it appear vulnerable to enemy attack, while concentrating his main force for a devastating counterstroke at the Allied center. It was a strategy that required perfect timing and absolute confidence in his soldiers' ability to execute his plans under the most extreme pressure. The night before the battle, Napoleon walked among his troops, stopping to speak with groups of soldiers huddled around their campfires. They called him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a title that acknowledged his common touch despite his imperial dignity. He knew many of them by name, remembered their acts of courage in previous battles, asked after their families and their health. "Tomorrow," he told them, "will be the anniversary of my coronation. 1 year ago, you saw me crowned in Notre Dame. Tomorrow, you will crown me on the field of battle with victory." As dawn broke over the battlefield, revealing the Allied armies massed on the heights like a great amphitheater of steel and uniforms, Napoleon delivered one of his most famous proclamations: "Soldiers, the Russian army presents itself before you to avenge the Austrian army of Ulm. These are the same battalions you broke at Hollabrunn and have since pursued constantly to this place. The position we occupy is formidable, and while they march to turn my right, they will present their flank to me." The battle unfolded exactly as Napoleon had foreseen. The Allied attack on the French right wing, commanded by Marshal Davout, met fierce resistance but appeared to be making progress. This success drew more and more Allied forces away from their center, weakening the very position that Napoleon intended to attack. At precisely 9 a.m., as the winter sun emerged from behind the clouds to illuminate the battlefield, Napoleon gave the signal for his masterstroke. Marshal Soult's IV Corps, concealed in the valley below the Pratzen Heights, emerged from the morning mist like an avenging army of ghosts. The attack was so sudden and so perfectly timed that the Allied center collapsed within hours. The sight of French eagles appearing on the Pratzen Heights, where the Allied emperors had stood in confident expectation of victory just hours before, shattered the morale of the entire coalition army. Units that had fought with desperate courage found themselves isolated and surrounded, while their commanders struggled to comprehend how victory had turned to disaster so quickly. The psychological impact of the defeat was perhaps even greater than the tactical one. The Allied emperors, Alexander of Russia and Francis of Austria, were forced to flee their own battlefield, abandoning their soldiers to capture or death. The myth of their divine right to rule, already weakened by the revolutionary upheavals of the previous decades, suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. Napoleon's pursuit of the broken enemy was relentless but calculated. He understood that the goal was not mere destruction, but the kind of decisive victory that would reshape the political landscape of Europe. When the Russian Imperial Guard made its last desperate charge to save the honor of the Tsar, Napoleon watched their approach with the cold appreciation of a connoisseur. "Look at these beautiful horses," he remarked to his staff. "How sad to think that in a few minutes they will all be dead." The charge was indeed magnificent, and ultimately futile. The Guard cavalry broke themselves against the solid ranks of French infantry, their courage serving only to provide a fitting epilogue to the greatest tactical masterpiece of Napoleon's career. The battle ended with the surreal sight of thousands of Allied soldiers fleeing across the frozen ponds south of Austerlitz. Napoleon ordered his artillery to break the ice, and the sight of enemy soldiers disappearing beneath the dark waters became one of the most haunting images of the Napoleonic Wars. The political consequences of Austerlitz were immediate and far-reaching. Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Pressburg, ceding Venice to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy and recognizing French hegemony over German affairs. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient institution that had supposedly lasted 1,000 years, was formally dissolved, its eagle replaced by the more potent symbol of the French imperial bee. Russia withdrew from the coalition, leaving Britain isolated in its opposition to Napoleon's continental system. The map of Europe was redrawn to reflect the new reality of French power, with Napoleon's brothers and marshals installed as kings and princes across the continent. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Austerlitz was its effect on Napoleon himself. The victory had been so complete, so artistically perfect, that it seemed to confirm his belief in his own destiny. He was no longer merely a successful general or even a powerful emperor. He was the master of Europe, the architect of a new world order, the man who had proven that genius and will could triumph over tradition and numbers. Standing on the battlefield as evening fell, watching his soldiers collect the trophies of victory, enemy flags, captured cannons, the personal effects of dead and wounded foes, Napoleon must have felt that he had reached the summit of human achievement. The sun of Austerlitz had risen on his greatest triumph, illuminating not just a battlefield, but the birth of a new age. Yet even in the moment of supreme victory, there were shadows on the horizon. Britain remained undefeated, its navy still ruling the waves. Spain chafed under the continental system that sought to exclude British trade from Europe. And in the east, Russia's withdrawal from the coalition was tactical rather than strategic. The bear was wounded but not dead, and it would remember the humiliation of Austerlitz when the time came for revenge. But these concerns belonged to the future. For now Napoleon stood triumphant on the field of his greatest battle. The emperor who had proven that even emperors could be defeated when they faced a man who understood that war was not just about courage and tradition, but about mathematics and timing, psychology and logistics, the cold calculation of genius applied to the eternal human struggle for power. The sun of Austerlitz had set, but its light would illuminate the pages of history for centuries to come. Listen to the wind as it whispers across the vast expanse of Europe in the summer of 1807, carrying with it the echoes of cannon fire from the plains of Prussia and the scent of victory from a dozen battlefields. Napoleon stands at the height of his power, master of a continent that stretches from the Atlantic to the Vistula, and in his mind burns a vision of empire that would make Alexander and Caesar seem like provincial governors. Picture the emperor as he stood on a raft anchored in the middle of the Niemen River, meeting with Tsar Alexander I of Russia in one of history's most dramatic diplomatic encounters. The two rulers, who had been mortal enemies just weeks before, now embraced like brothers, their reconciliation sealing the fate of Europe for years to come. The treaties of Tilsit, signed in July 1807, represented the culmination of Napoleon's continental strategy. By dividing Europe with Russia, he sought to create a system that would exclude British commerce from the continent, while establishing French hegemony over the western half of Europe. It was a vision of breathtaking audacity, a new Roman Empire built not on legions alone, but on the more subtle foundations of economic warfare and diplomatic alliance. The years following Tilsit marked the zenith of the Napoleonic Empire. From his palace in the Tuileries, Napoleon governed a realm that included not just France, but much of Germany, Italy, and Poland. His brothers ruled as kings in Spain, Holland, and Westphalia, while his marshals administered duchies and principalities scattered across the continent. It was a family empire, bound together by ties of blood and loyalty, as much as by military force. But Napoleon's vision extended far beyond mere territorial aggrandizement. He dreamed of creating a unified Europe, governed by rational laws and efficient administration, where the barriers of nationalism and feudalism would give way to a cosmopolitan civilization based on merit and achievement. The Code Napoleon was exported to every corner of his empire, while French-educated administrators worked to modernize societies that had remained virtually unchanged since the Middle Ages. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the business of empire had been concluded for the day, Napoleon would often retreat to his private study and lose himself in maps and documents that revealed the scope of his achievements. Here were reports from his prefects in Hamburg and Rome, dispatches from his generals in Poland and Portugal, statistics showing the flow of trade and the collection of taxes across a continent that acknowledged him as master. The continental system, his great economic weapon against Britain, was showing signs of success. British exports to Europe had fallen dramatically, and there were reports of unemployment and distress in the industrial cities of Manchester and Birmingham. Napoleon believed that he was fighting not just a military war, but a conflict that would determine the future of civilization, whether Europe would be dominated by the landed aristocracy and commercial interests of Britain, or by the rational, meritocratic ideals of revolutionary France. Yet even at the height of his success, Napoleon was beginning to encounter the limitations that constrain all human ambition, no matter how extraordinary. The Spanish ulcer, as he would later call it, was already beginning to drain his resources and reputation. The proud Spanish people, despite the inefficiency of their government and the corruption of their nobility, proved remarkably resistant to French rule. In the mountains and villages of the peninsula, a new kind of warfare was emerging, the guerrilla war that would give its name to a form of conflict that would plague empires for centuries to come. The marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 represented both the pinnacle of Napoleon's dynastic ambitions and a tacit admission that his empire required legitimacy that could only come from alliance with the old European order. By divorcing Josephine, the woman who had shared his rise to power, and marrying the daughter of the Habsburg emperor, Napoleon sought to transform himself from a revolutionary upstart into an accepted member of the European family of rulers. The wedding ceremony at the Louvre was a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence. The bride, just 19 years old, was the great niece of Marie Antoinette, and her marriage to the man who had helped destroy the old regime represented a stunning reversal of fortune for the House of Habsburg. But it also marked a subtle but significant change in Napoleon's relationship with the French people, who had followed him not because of his bloodline, but because of his embodiment of their revolutionary ideals. The birth of the King of Rome in 1811 seemed to complete Napoleon's transformation from emperor to dynasty founder. Holding his infant son in his arms, Napoleon could envision a future in which the Bonaparte name would join those of Charlemagne and Louis XIV in the pantheon of European royalty. The child would inherit not just an empire, but a new world order based on French principles and administered by French methods. But empires, like men, contain within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. The continental system, for all its initial success, was creating tensions that threatened to tear apart the very alliances on which Napoleon's power depended. Russia, devastated by the loss of its traditional trade with Britain, was beginning to chafe under the restrictions imposed by Tilsit. Alexander I, that mercurial ruler who combined romantic idealism with hard-headed realpolitik, was receiving reports from his merchants and nobles that painted the French alliance in increasingly unfavorable terms. In the salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow, the conversation was turning toward the ancient Russian concept of destiny. The belief that the Russian Empire had a special mission to defend Orthodox Christianity and Slavic culture against the encroachments of the rationalist West. The idea that Russia should play a subordinate role in a French-dominated Europe was beginning to seem not just economically disadvantageous, but spiritually corrupting. Napoleon, absorbed in the administration of his vast empire, was perhaps slow to recognize the signs of this growing estrangement. His intelligence network, efficient though it was, could not fully penetrate the complexities of Russian court politics or the deep currents of Russian national sentiment. He saw Alexander's increasing independence as a tactical maneuver rather than a fundamental shift in Russian policy. The economic pressures created by the continental system were also beginning to strain Napoleon's relationship with his own subjects. French merchants, cut off from traditional markets and forced to find new outlets for their goods, complained increasingly about the restrictions imposed by the emperor's economic warfare. The prosperity that had initially accompanied the peace was giving way to stagnation and frustration. In the German states, the awakening of national consciousness that Napoleon had inadvertently encouraged was beginning to take forms that threatened French hegemony. The very efficiency of French administration, the rationality of French law, and the meritocracy of French institutions had created a new generation of German intellectuals and administrators who wondered why these benefits could not be enjoyed under German rather than French leadership. The writings of philosophers like Fichte and Herder were circulating through German universities, spreading ideas about national destiny and cultural authenticity that challenged the cosmopolitan ideals of the Napoleonic system. In the coffee houses of Berlin and Vienna, students and professors discussed the possibility of a German nation that would combine French efficiency with German spirit, French organization with German culture. Even in Italy, that patchwork of states that had benefited enormously from French rule, there were stirrings of a new kind of patriotism. The very success of French administration in eliminating the old particularisms and inefficiencies had created a more unified Italian consciousness that began to question why Italians needed French leadership to govern themselves effectively. Napoleon, surveying his empire from the heights of the Tuileries, could see the magnificent scope of his achievements: a continent unified under rational government, a legal system that guaranteed equality before the law, an administrative structure that promoted merit over birth. But he was perhaps less able to perceive the deeper currents of change that his own success had set in motion. The continental dream was reaching its apotheosis, but it was also approaching its crisis. The very forces that Napoleon had unleashed in his rise to power, nationalism, popular sovereignty, the career open to talents, were beginning to work against the empire he had created. The master of Europe was about to discover that empires, like revolutions, have a momentum of their own, and that even the greatest of emperors cannot forever control the forces that they have awakened. As the year 1810 drew to a close, with his new Austrian bride by his side, and his infant son sleeping in the imperial nursery, Napoleon could look back on achievements that surpassed those of any conqueror in history. But the winds of change were beginning to blow across the vast expanse of his empire, carrying with them the seeds of conflicts that would test his genius to its very limits. In the deepest hours of winter night, when the world lies shrouded in darkness, and the only sound is the whisper of wind through frozen trees, imagine a city burning. Picture Moscow in September 1812, that ancient heart of Russia, consumed by flames that painted the sky the color of blood and cast dancing shadows across streets that had known the footsteps of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. This was Napoleon's Moscow, won by the greatest military campaign in history and lost in the span of a single month. Here, in the charred ruins of the Kremlin palaces, the emperor who had conquered Europe would confront the limitations of power and the terrible arithmetic of human ambition. The road to Moscow began not with the crack of muskets or the thunder of artillery, but with the slow deterioration of an alliance that had once seemed to guarantee peace in Europe. The Treaty of Tilsit, that masterpiece of diplomatic theatre performed on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, had bound France and Russia together in a partnership that divided the continent between them. But alliances, like marriages, require constant attention, and by 1810 the honeymoon was decidedly over. Tsar Alexander I, that enigmatic ruler who combined the soul of a mystic with the mind of a politician, found himself caught between his agreement with Napoleon and the growing discontent of his own people. Russian merchants, cut off from British trade by the continental system, saw their fortunes evaporating like morning mist. Russian nobles whose estates produced grain and timber for export watched their revenues disappear into the maze of French commercial regulations. More troubling still was the growth of French influence in Poland. That historic battlefield between German, Russian, and French ambitions. Napoleon's creation of the Duchy of Warsaw had given new hope to Polish patriots who dreamed of restoring their ancient kingdom, but it had also raised the specter of a French client state on Russia's very doorstep. In the salons of St. Petersburg, where candlelight reflected off crystal chandeliers, and the conversation flowed as smoothly as French champagne, the talk increasingly turned to questions of honor and independence. Could Russia, that great power which had humbled the Swedes and faced down the Turks, continue to play a subordinate role in Napoleon's continental system? Napoleon, from his study in the Tuileries, watched these developments with the cool analysis of a chess master contemplating his opponent's position. He understood that war with Russia was becoming inevitable, but he approached the prospect with confidence, born of a dozen victorious campaigns. Had he not defeated every coalition that Europe could form against him? Had he not proven at Austerlitz and Jena that neither numbers nor tradition could stand against superior strategy and revolutionary élan? The Grande Armée that assembled on the banks of the Niemen in June 1812 was the largest military force that Europe had ever seen. Nearly 600,000 men from every corner of the continent marched under the French eagles. Not just Frenchmen, but Germans and Italians, Poles and Dutch, even Spaniards and Portuguese pressed into service for this greatest of all campaigns. It was a truly international army, bound together not by nationality but by the shared experience of Napoleonic warfare and the intoxicating promise of glory and plunder in the mysterious East. veterans of Austerlitz marched alongside conscripts who had never heard a shot fired in anger, while Napoleon's marshals, those men who had risen from sergeants to princes through courage and competence, commanded corps larger than the entire armies of previous centuries. The crossing of the Niemen on June 24, 1812, was accomplished with the precision that had become the hallmark of Napoleonic operations. But from the very beginning, this campaign would be different from all that had preceded it. The enemy refused to give battle, melting away before the advancing French columns like snow before the spring sun. Prince Barclay de Tolly, the Russian commander, had studied the history of Napoleon's previous campaigns with the thoroughness of a monk studying scripture. He understood that the emperor's genius lay in his ability to force decisive battles in which superior French tactics and morale could overcome numerical disadvantages. The solution was elegantly simple: deny Napoleon the battle he sought, trade space for time, and allow the vast distances of Russia to accomplish what Austrian armies and Prussian discipline had failed to achieve. The strategy was controversial among Russian officers trained in the aggressive traditions of Suvorov, but it was brutally effective. Day after day, week after week, the Grande Armée marched deeper into Russia, finding only empty villages and abandoned supply depots. The country seemed to have been swallowed by its own immensity, leaving nothing but endless horizons and the constant pressure of Cossack raids on the French flanks and rear. Napoleon, riding at the head of his guard through the dust clouds raised by 500,000 men, began to understand that he was fighting not just an army, but a nation, not just a government, but a people's will to resist. The very size of Russia, which had initially seemed like an advantage, more territory to conquer, more resources to exploit, was becoming a weakness that sapped the strength of his forces with every mile they advanced. The Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, was the collision that both armies had been seeking since the campaign began. Here, finally, was the decisive engagement that Napoleon needed to validate his strategy and that the Russians required to defend their ancient capital. The battle was fought with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of the bloodiest European conflicts, two great armies locked in mortal combat amid the rolling hills and forests of central Russia. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared from the battlefield, Napoleon could claim a tactical victory. The Russian army had withdrawn, leaving the road to Moscow open to French advance. But it had been a victory bought at a terrible price: 30,000 French casualties against 45,000 Russian, losses that the Grande Armée could ill afford so far from its bases of supply. More troubling still was the realization that even this bloody triumph had not achieved its strategic objective. The Russian army, though battered, remained intact and capable of further resistance. Moscow lay just ahead. But what then? How do you make peace with an enemy who refuses to acknowledge defeat? The entry into Moscow on September 14, 1812, should have been the culmination of Napoleon's career, the moment when the master of Western Europe extended his dominion to the very gates of Asia. Instead, it was the beginning of his greatest disaster. The ancient capital of the Tsars was virtually empty. Its population fled, its palaces and churches echoing with the footsteps of French soldiers who had expected to find triumph and discovered only abandonment. That night, as Napoleon established his headquarters in the Kremlin, fires began to break out across the city. Whether set by Russian agents acting under government orders, or by patriotic citizens choosing to destroy their homes rather than see them occupied by foreign troops, the flames spread with supernatural speed through the wooden structures that comprised much of Moscow. For 3 days and nights the city burned. Standing at the windows of the Kremlin, Napoleon watched his prize consume itself in an inferno that lit the autumn sky and filled the air with smoke and ash. It was as if Russia itself was immolating its treasures, rather than surrender them to the conqueror of Europe. The psychological impact of the burning of Moscow was perhaps even greater than its strategic consequences. Napoleon had come to Russia expecting to fight a campaign like those that had brought him victory in Germany and Austria, swift, decisive, concluded by a favorable peace treaty signed in the enemy capital. Instead, he found himself master of a city of ruins, ruler of an empire of ashes. For 5 weeks he remained in Moscow, hoping against hope that Alexander would send envoys to negotiate. He wrote letters to the Tsar, offering generous terms for peace, promising to withdraw from all Russian territory in exchange for recognition of his European conquests. But no answer came from St. Petersburg, only the silence of a nation that had chosen to endure any suffering rather than submit to foreign domination. As October turned toward November and the first snows began to dust the burnt timbers of Moscow, Napoleon was forced to confront a truth that his previous victories had allowed him to avoid, that there are limits to what military genius can accomplish, boundaries beyond which even the greatest of emperors cannot pass. The decision to retreat, when it finally came, was perhaps the most difficult of Napoleon's career. To abandon Moscow was to admit that the greatest campaign in history had failed, that the Grande Armée had marched 1,000 miles, only to discover that conquest without acceptance is merely temporary occupation. The retreat from Moscow began on October 19, 1812, and quickly became one of the most harrowing episodes in military history. The Russian winter, arriving early and with unusual severity, transformed the withdrawal into a race against time and the elements. Soldiers who had marched into Russia dreaming of glory found themselves struggling simply to survive, abandoning equipment and supplies as they fled westward across the frozen steppes. The crossing of the Berezina River in November became an epic of heroism and horror, as the remnants of the Grande Armée fought desperately to escape the pursuing Russians, while engineers worked in icy water to construct bridges under enemy fire. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen in June, fewer than 40,000 would recross it in anything resembling military order. Napoleon himself abandoned the army in December, racing back to Paris in a closed carriage to deal with the political crisis that news of the disaster had precipitated. Behind him, he left the frozen corpses of an empire's dreams, scattered across the endless expanse of Russia, like markers of ambition's furthest reach. The Moscow fire had consumed more than buildings and supplies. It had burned away the myth of Napoleonic invincibility, revealing to Europe that the emperor was not, after all, the master of destiny that he had seemed. In the chancelleries of Vienna and Berlin, in the drawing rooms of London and the palaces of St. Petersburg, men began to speak again of victory, of liberation, of the possibility that the French Empire might not be eternal after all. The retreat from Moscow was ending, but the fall of Napoleon was just beginning. Picture Europe in the winter of 1813, awakening from a 20-year nightmare like a man emerging from fever dreams. The news of Napoleon's disaster in Russia had spread across the continent with the speed of wildfire, carried by merchants and diplomats, smugglers and spies, until even the remotest villages knew that the emperor who had seemed invincible was mortal after all. In the frozen forests of Prussia, in the coffee houses of Vienna, in the secret meetings of German patriots and Italian conspirators, men who had bowed their heads before French eagles for a generation began to lift their eyes and speak again of freedom. The chains that had bound Europe to Napoleon's empire were beginning to rust and weaken, and from every corner of the continent came the sound of nations stirring in their sleep. The emperor who returned to Paris in December 1812 was a different man from the one who had departed for Moscow 6 months earlier. The retreat across the Russian steppes had aged him beyond his years, etching lines of exhaustion and doubt into features that had once radiated absolute confidence. His hair, once lustrous and dark, was beginning to thin and grey, while his famous energy seemed dimmed by the weight of disaster and the burden of rebuilding an empire that many now believed was doomed. But Napoleon possessed one quality that distinguished him from ordinary men: the ability to transform setbacks into opportunities, to find in defeat the seeds of future victory. Within weeks of his return, he was working 18 hours a day, dictating letters to his secretaries, meeting with his ministers, reviewing maps and reports with the systematic thoroughness that had made him master of Europe. The task that faced him was daunting beyond imagination. The Grande Armée that had marched into Russia with such confidence lay scattered across the frozen wastes between Moscow and Warsaw, its survivors straggling back to France with tales of horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen, fewer than 30,000 remained fit for active service. Worse still was the political damage inflicted by the Russian catastrophe. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of brilliant victories, had been shattered by the reality of retreat and defeat. Across Europe, rulers who had submitted to French hegemony out of necessity rather than conviction began to calculate whether the emperor was still strong enough to punish defection. In Prussia, King Frederick William III found himself caught between his treaty obligations to France and the growing pressure from his subjects for liberation from foreign domination. The humiliation of Jena and Auerstedt, those twin defeats that had reduced Prussia to a French satellite, still burned in the hearts of his people. The military reforms instituted by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had created a new Prussian army, smaller than the old, but imbued with the patriotic fervor that Napoleon had taught Europe to value. The decision to break with France, when it came in March 1813, was both inevitable and revolutionary. For the first time since the disasters of 1806, Prussia would fight not as part of a coalition dominated by foreign powers, but as the leader of a specifically German war of liberation. The royal proclamation "To my people" struck a new note in European politics. The appeal not to dynastic interest or diplomatic calculation, but to the awakened consciousness of a nation. In Austria, the calculations were more complex, but no less momentous. Emperor Francis V found himself in the extraordinary position of being Napoleon's father-in-law, while simultaneously planning his downfall. The marriage of Marie-Louise to the French emperor, intended to cement an alliance between the two great continental powers, had instead become a source of perpetual tension and embarrassment. Metternich, that master of diplomatic chess who would dominate European politics for the next generation, understood that Austria's future lay not in continued subservience to France, but in the restoration of a European balance of power. He maneuvered with exquisite care, offering to mediate between France and its enemies, while secretly preparing to join the coalition that would bring Napoleon down. The summer campaign of 1813 in Germany revealed both Napoleon's continued genius and the limitations that now constrained his abilities. The army he assembled to meet the new coalition was a shadow of the Grande Armée that had conquered Europe. Barely 200,000 men, many of them raw conscripts who had never seen battle, led by marshals grown cautious with age and repeated disasters. Yet Napoleon's strategic vision remained as clear as ever. He understood that his only hope lay in defeating his enemies separately before they could unite their full strength against him. The battles of Lutzen and Bautzen demonstrated that the emperor had lost none of his tactical brilliance, but they also revealed that tactical victories without strategic consequences were merely postponements of the inevitable reckoning. The armies that faced him were no longer the rigid, hierarchical forces of the old regime that he had defeated so often in the past. They were imbued with something new, the spirit of national resistance that Napoleon himself had unleashed through his revolutionary conquests. German soldiers fought not just for their kings, but for the idea of German freedom. Russian troops carried with them the memory of Moscow's flames and the determination to drive the invader from European soil. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of the Nations as it came to be known, was the largest engagement in European history before the 20th century. For 3 days, nearly 500,000 men clashed in the fields and villages around the Saxon city, while the fate of the continent hung in the balance. Napoleon fought with the desperate brilliance of a man who understood that he was playing for the highest stakes imaginable. His tactical combinations were as elegant as ever, his ability to inspire his troops undiminished by the disasters of the previous year. But he was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, and his enemies had learned to copy his methods while avoiding his strengths. The defection of the Saxon army during the battle sealed Napoleon's fate. Watching his German allies turn their guns against their former commander, he must have understood that this was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of the entire system that had made him master of Europe. The loyalty that had once bound the German states to France was revealed as opportunism, while the fear that had enforced obedience had given way to contempt for French weakness. The retreat from Leipzig was conducted with the same skill that had marked all of Napoleon's operations, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the disaster. The French army limped back across the Rhine, abandoning in a few weeks conquests that had taken a decade to secure. Behind them, they left a German confederation freed from French control and united for the first time in centuries by a common sense of national purpose. The invasion of France itself began in the new year of 1814, as the armies of the Sixth Coalition crossed the Rhine and advanced toward Paris. For the first time since the early days of the Revolution, foreign troops marched on French soil, carrying with them the banners of liberation and revenge. Napoleon's defense of France in the winter and spring of 1814 was perhaps the most brilliant campaign of his entire career. With barely 70,000 men against more than 300,000 enemies, he fought a series of battles that recalled the genius of his youth. At Champaubert, Montmirail, and Château-Thierry, he defeated Allied forces with the same lightning combinations that had made him famous in Italy 20 years earlier. But brilliance alone could not overcome the mathematics of the situation. France was exhausted by 20 years of war, its treasury empty, its people weary of sacrifice for imperial glory. The marshals who had followed Napoleon from Egypt to Moscow began to speak of peace, while the politicians in Paris calculated the advantages of negotiating with the Allies. The end, when it came, was both dramatic and anticlimactic. On March 31, 1814, the Allied armies entered Paris, received not as conquerors but as liberators by a population that had grown tired of empire and yearned for peace. The Senate, that body of notables who had rubber-stamped Napoleon's decrees for a decade, voted to depose the emperor and invite the Bourbon dynasty to return from exile. At Fontainebleau, in the palace where he had signed his civil code and planned his greatest campaigns, Napoleon confronted the collapse of everything he had built. His marshals, those men who owed their titles and fortunes to his favor, came to him one by one to explain why continued resistance was impossible. Even his beloved Guard, the elite unit that had followed him from the pyramids to the Kremlin, was showing signs of war weariness and doubt. The abdication document, when he finally signed it on April 6, 1814, was both an ending and a beginning. The emperor, who had reshaped Europe with his will, was reduced to the status of a private citizen. granted the tiny island of Elba as his domain and a pension from the restored Bourbon government. As he prepared to leave Fontainebleau for his island exile, Napoleon addressed the Guard for what everyone believed would be the last time. His words, spoken to soldiers who had shared his glory and his defeats, captured both the magnitude of his achievements and the poignancy of his fall. "Soldiers of my old Guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have constantly accompanied you on the road to honor and glory. In these latter times, as in the days of our prosperity, you have invariably been models of courage and fidelity. With men such as you, our cause could not be lost, but the war would have been interminable. It would have been civil war, and that would have entailed deeper misfortunes on France. The empire that had begun with a coup d'etat in a Paris drawing room was ending with a resignation in a provincial palace." The boy from Corsica who had conquered Europe was sailing into exile, leaving behind a continent that would struggle for generations to understand what he had meant and what his fall represented. But exile, as Europe would soon discover, was not the same as extinction. And the man who had already risen from provincial obscurity to imperial grandeur was about to prove that even the most dramatic endings could sometimes be merely intermissions in a larger drama. In the depths of winter, when the Mediterranean winds howl across the rocky shores of Elba, imagine a small man in a grey overcoat standing at the edge of exile, gazing across the dark waters toward the coast of France. For 10 months, Napoleon Bonaparte had been the ruler of this tiny island, reduced from Emperor of the French to sovereign of 12,000 souls and a handful of iron mines. But exile, for a man who had once held the fate of Europe in his hands, was not retirement. It was merely another form of warfare, fought with different weapons in a smaller arena. And in the winter of 1815, as reports reached Elba of growing discontent in France and division among the Allied powers, the fallen emperor began to calculate the odds of one final throw of the dice. The France that the Bourbon had reclaimed in 1814 was not the France they had left 25 years earlier. A generation had grown up under the empire, knowing no other law than the Code Napoleon, no other ideal than the career open to talents, no other loyalty than to the tricolour that had carried French arms to the ends of Europe. Louis XVIII, that corpulent monarch who had returned in the baggage train of foreign armies, found himself ruling a nation that had been transformed beyond recognition. The Bourbon Restoration had begun with promises of reconciliation and moderation, but the returned émigrés who surrounded the new king brought with them the bitter memories of exile and the determination to reclaim what they saw as their rightful place in French society. Veterans of the Grande Armée found themselves dismissed from service or reduced in rank, while the eagles that had carried them to glory were replaced by the white flags of the old regime. In the cafés of Paris and the drawing rooms of the provinces, men who had served the empire with distinction found themselves treated as relics of a discredited past. The very achievements that had made France the dominant power in Europe were now presented as crimes against legitimate authority, while the emperor who had given France its greatest glory was depicted as a tyrant whose fall had liberated Europe from oppression. But memories are stubborn things, and the memories of imperial grandeur proved remarkably resistant to official attempts at revisionism. In the barracks where old soldiers gathered to drink and reminisce, in the prefectures where former administrators chafed under incompetent Bourbon appointees, in the law courts where judges trained in Napoleonic jurisprudence found themselves applying the confused mixture of old and new regulations that passed for royal policy, there was a growing sense that France had traded its birthright for a mess of pottage. Reports of this discontent reached Napoleon on Elba through a network of contacts that he had carefully maintained despite his exile. His correspondence, officially limited to family matters, actually carried a constant stream of political intelligence that kept him informed of every development on the mainland. He learned of the mistakes made by the Bourbon government, the growing unpopularity of the returned émigrés, and most importantly, the division among the Allied powers that had united to defeat him. The Congress of Vienna, convened to reorganize Europe after Napoleon's fall, was proving to be less a celebration of victory than a squabble over the spoils. Britain and Austria found themselves at odds with Russia and Prussia over the future of Poland and Saxony, while old rivalries and competing ambitions threatened to fragment the coalition that had brought down the French Empire. It was this intelligence, combined with his own restless nature and the conviction that his destiny was not yet fulfilled, that led Napoleon to make the most audacious decision of his career. On the night of February 26, 1815, he slipped away from Elba with a handful of loyal followers, sailing through the British naval blockade in a small brig toward the coast of France. The landing at Golfe Juan on March 1, 1815, was both an anticlimax and an apotheosis. Napoleon stepped ashore with fewer than 1,000 men, facing a hostile government backed by all the powers of Europe. By any rational calculation, the expedition was doomed to failure. But Napoleon had never been governed by rational calculations alone. He understood the power of legend, the magnetism of charisma, and the deep currents of popular sentiment that could sweep away the most carefully constructed political arrangements. The march to Paris that followed was unlike any military campaign in history. Napoleon advanced not by fighting battles, but by winning hearts, not by defeating armies, but by converting them. At every town and village, crowds gathered to see the returned emperor, while soldiers sent to arrest him threw down their weapons and joined his growing procession. The most dramatic moment came near Grenoble, when Napoleon encountered a regiment of the Royal Army, commanded by officers who had served under him in Italy and Germany. As the soldiers raised their muskets, Napoleon walked toward them alone, opening his grey overcoat to expose his chest. "Soldiers," he called out in the voice that had addressed them from the pyramids to the Kremlin, "if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it contained within it the entire drama of the moment. Then the cry went up, "Vive l'Empereur!" and the regiment that had come to arrest Napoleon found itself escorting him toward the capital. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, had promised Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. Instead, he met his former commander at Auxerre and fell into his arms, overcome by memories of shared campaigns and the magnetic personality that had made Napoleon the most beloved leader in French history. By March 20th, Napoleon was in Paris, installed once again in the Tuileries, while Louis XV fled toward the Belgian frontier. The 100 Days had begun, that extraordinary period when the man who had been written off as a historical footnote returned to center stage for one final, magnificent performance. But the Europe that Napoleon faced in 1815 was not the Europe he had conquered 20 years earlier. The nationalism that he had awakened with his revolutionary conquests had turned against him, while the powers that had defeated him were more united in their opposition than they had ever been before. Within days of his return, the Congress of Vienna had declared him an outlaw, and new armies were already marching toward French frontiers. Napoleon understood that his only hope lay in striking before his enemies could complete their preparations. With characteristic energy, he set about rebuilding the army that would have to face the combined forces of Europe. Veterans flocked to his standards from across France, while the weapons factories worked day and night to equip the force that would have to win quickly or not at all. The campaign that followed was fought under conditions that would have daunted a lesser commander. Napoleon faced enemies on every frontier, while his own resources were limited to what France alone could provide. The spirit was willing, the enthusiasm for the returned emperor was genuine and widespread, but the flesh was weak. France had been bled white by 20 years of warfare, and there were limits to what even the most patriotic nation could endure. The decision to march into Belgium and attack the Allied armies before they could unite was both strategically sound and tactically necessary. Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army and Blücher's Prussians, if allowed to combine with the Austrian and Russian forces assembling in Germany, would outnumber the French by more than 2 to 1. Napoleon's only chance lay in defeating them separately, using the superior speed and concentration that had won him so many victories in the past. The battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras, fought on June 16, 1815, showed that the emperor had lost none of his tactical skill. The Prussians were defeated and driven from the field, while Wellington's advance was checked and his army forced to retreat. For a moment, it seemed that the old magic might work once more, that genius and audacity might triumph over numbers and resources. But the campaign was already overshadowed by the knowledge that this would be Napoleon's last chance. Win or lose, the 100 days would end at Waterloo on a ridge in Belgium where the fate of Europe would be decided by a single afternoon's fighting. As Napoleon surveyed the battlefield on the morning of June 18, 1815, he could see spread out before him not just Wellington's army, but the entire trajectory of his extraordinary career. Here was the culmination of everything he had learned about warfare, leadership, and the management of men. Here was the final test of the methods and principles that had carried him from the artillery school at Brienne to the throne of France. The boy from Corsica had become a man in his 46th year, his dark hair now streaked with grey, his face marked by the campaigns and cares of a quarter-century of warfare. But his eyes were still bright with the intelligence that had made him master of Europe, and his voice still carried the authority that could turn civilians into soldiers and soldiers into heroes. Standing on the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean with the sounds of preparation echoing across the battlefield and the smell of gunpowder already in the air, Napoleon was about to fight the most important battle of his life. The empire that had begun with a young general's dreams of glory would end, one way or another, before the sun set on this summer day in Belgium. Listen. Can you hear it? The sound of waves breaking against volcanic rock, somewhere in the South Atlantic where the trade winds carry the scent of exile across waters that have known no conquerors since the days of sail. This is St. Helena, that remote speck of British territory, where the man who once held Europe in his hands would spend his final years, transforming defeat into legend and exile into immortality. Picture Napoleon on the evening of October 15, 1815, standing on the deck of HMS Northumberland as it approached the island that would become his final home. Behind him lay Waterloo, that terrible Sunday in June, when the sound of Prussian drums had announced the end of empire. Behind him lay the abdication, the Allied occupation, the reluctant decision to surrender himself to British protection rather than face the revenge of his European enemies. The island that rose from the South Atlantic mists was like a fortress built by nature herself, 15 miles long, 10 miles wide, surrounded by cliffs that rose nearly vertically from the sea. There was only one harbour, one road to the interior, and that road was guarded by British troops, who would ensure that the most dangerous man in Europe could never again threaten the peace of the world. Longwood House, where Napoleon would spend his final years, was a damp, wind-swept structure that seemed designed to break the spirit of its illustrious prisoner. The rooms were small and poorly furnished, the gardens limited and constantly watched by British sentries, the horizon bounded by the endless expanse of ocean that separated St. Helena from the civilized world. But exile, for a man of Napoleon's extraordinary mental resources, became not a punishment, but an opportunity. the chance to wage a final campaign for historical immortality with the only weapons that remained to him: his memory, his voice, and his incomparable understanding of human nature. The companions who shared his exile were a diverse group, united only by their loyalty to the fallen emperor. Count Bertrand, his faithful Grand Marshal, had chosen exile over accommodation with the restored Bourbon. General Gourgaud, young and passionate, burned with indignation at his master's treatment. Count de Montauban, perhaps the most complex of the group, combined genuine devotion with personal ambition in ways that Napoleon understood perfectly. But it was Emmanuel de Las Cases, the former chamberlain who had abandoned comfort and safety to follow his emperor into exile, who would prove most crucial to Napoleon's final campaign. Las Cases possessed something that the others lacked: literary talent combined with historical vision, the ability to transform conversations into literature and defeat into triumph. The Memorial of Saint-Ouen. Helena, that masterpiece of political autobiography that Las Cases compiled from his daily conversations with Napoleon, would become one of the most influential books of the 19th century. Through its pages, the emperor who had lost his throne would win something far more valuable: control over his own historical legacy. Day after day, in the stifling heat of the tropical afternoons or the damp chill of the island evenings, Napoleon would pace the gardens of Longwood and dictate his memories to Las Cases. But these were not mere reminiscences. They were carefully crafted arguments designed to influence the judgment of posterity, to transform the fallen tyrant of European imagination into the champion of liberty and national self-determination. The Napoleon who emerged from these conversations was subtly but significantly different from the historical figure who had actually ruled France for 15 years. The wars that had devastated Europe became defensive struggles against the malice of hereditary despots. The empire that had subordinated national interests to French ambition became a laboratory for enlightened government and rational administration. Most importantly, the emperor who had restored slavery in the French colonies and ruled as an absolute monarch became the heir of the revolution, the man who had carried the principles of 1789 to the ends of Europe and planted the seeds of liberation that would flower long after his death. This reinvention was not mere propaganda. It was the work of a genius who understood that historical truth is often less important than historical utility. Napoleon knew that the Europe emerging from the Congress of Vienna was unstable, built on foundations that could not withstand the pressures of nationalism and democracy that he had helped to unleash. The legend he was creating on St. Helena would serve as inspiration for future generations of revolutionaries and patriots. The daily routine at Longwood became a kind of ritual designed to maintain the dignity of fallen majesty. Napoleon rose late, dressed with the care of a man who understood that every gesture was symbolic, and held court in miniature with companions who still addressed him as Your Majesty and observed the elaborate etiquette of imperial protocol. But the real work of exile was conducted in the quiet hours when Napoleon, freed from the immediate pressures of government and warfare, could reflect on the larger patterns of his extraordinary career. He studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar with new eyes, understanding for the first time how victory and defeat were merely different phases in the eternal human struggle for meaning and remembrance. His conversations with Las Cases ranged across the entire spectrum of human knowledge: military science and political theory, literature and philosophy, the nature of leadership, and the dynamics of historical change. These dialogues, preserved in the memorial, revealed a Napoleon that few of his contemporaries had ever seen, not the practical administrator or the battlefield commander, but the visionary who had glimpsed possibilities that his age was not ready to understand. The British government, represented on St. Helena by Governor Hudson Lowe, seemed determined to make Napoleon's exile as uncomfortable as possible. The restrictions imposed on his movements, the limits placed on his correspondence, the petty humiliations designed to remind him of his fallen status, all of these became part of the legend that Napoleon was constructing with such care. Sir Hudson Lowe, that conscientious but unimaginative officer who had been charged with guarding Europe's most dangerous prisoner, found himself cast in the role of chief persecutor in a drama that was being performed not just for the handful of spectators on St. Helena, but for the judgment of history itself. The disputes over protocol and precedents that marked Napoleon's relationship with his British captors might have seemed trivial to outside observers, but they were actually crucial to the larger project of historical rehabilitation. By insisting on being treated as a sovereign rather than a prisoner, by refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of his captivity, Napoleon maintained the fiction that his exile was temporary, his defeat merely tactical. As the years passed on St. Helena, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate under the combined pressures of tropical climate, inadequate diet, and the psychological strain of enforced inactivity. The man who had once possessed seemingly inexhaustible energy found himself increasingly confined to his rooms, dependent on his companions for the intellectual stimulation that had always been as necessary to him as food or water. But his mind remained as sharp as ever, and his understanding of his historical situation grew more sophisticated with each passing month. He came to see that his exile was not an epilogue to his career, but its most important chapter, the period when Napoleon the Emperor would be transformed into Napoleon the Legend, the inspiration for generations of Europeans who would struggle to realize the ideals that he claimed to represent. The visitors who occasionally made their way to St. Helena found themselves in the presence of a man who seemed to have transcended his immediate circumstances. They expected to find a broken exile, consumed by bitterness and regret. Instead, they encountered a figure of almost supernatural dignity, a man who spoke of his past with the detachment of a historian and of his future with the confidence of someone who understood that death was merely another form of victory. Dr. Antomarchi, the Italian physician who attended Napoleon during his final illness, left a remarkable account of his patient's last months. Despite the ravages of disease, probably stomach cancer, though the exact cause of death would be debated for generations, Napoleon maintained his intellectual curiosity and his concern for his historical reputation until the very end. His final words, spoken in the delirium of his last illness, captured perfectly the essential drama of his extraordinary life. France, army, head of the army, Josephine. The boy from Corsica, the general of the Republic, the emperor of the French, the exile of St. Helena, all of these identities were present in those fragmentary phrases, the whole complex trajectory of a life that had encompassed more human experience than any single existence had a right to contain. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, his body worn out by a lifetime of superhuman effort, but his legend just beginning its conquest of the world. The British authorities, afraid that his grave might become a shrine for French patriots, buried him in an unmarked tomb in a valley on St. Helena, refusing even to inscribe his name on the headstone. But graves, like empires, are temporary things. In 1840, 19 years after his death, Napoleon's remains were returned to France with pomp that rivaled his coronation. The funeral procession that carried his coffin through the streets of Paris was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of French citizens who had never known the empire but had grown up with the legend of its founder. The tomb in the Invalides, that magnificent memorial where Napoleon's remains finally came to rest, became what his British captors had feared it would be, a shrine not just to the memory of the emperor, but to the ideals of national greatness and individual achievement that he had come to represent. From his island of exile, Napoleon had won his greatest victory, not over armies or nations, but over time itself. The man who had failed to create a lasting empire had succeeded in creating something far more durable, a legend that would inspire revolutionaries and patriots, dreamers and conquerors for generations to come. In the quiet of night, when the winds blow across the empty spaces where his armies once marched, you can still hear the echo of his voice, still sense the presence of the man who proved that individual will, properly applied, could reshape the very foundations of civilization. The emperor is dead, but the legend lives on, immortal as the dreams of glory that burn in every human heart. The boy from Corsica had become something greater than any earthly throne could contain. He had become a permanent part of human consciousness, a reminder that there are no limits to what extraordinary individuals can achieve when they dare to dream beyond the boundaries of their age. And in that transformation, perhaps, lies the true measure of his success. For empires fade and battles are forgotten, but legends endure as long as human beings continue to dream of transcending the limitations of their birth and their circumstances. In creating the legend of Napoleon, the exile of St. Helena had achieved a form of immortality that no crown could provide. The story ends, but the dream continues, eternal as the human aspiration for greatness that Napoleon embodied so completely. In the whisper of wind across empty battlefields, in the turning of pages in history books, in the hearts of those who still believe that individual genius can change the world, the emperor lives on. And so we reach the end of our journey through the extraordinary life of Napoleon Bonaparte, that man who rose from provincial obscurity to reshape the very foundations of European civilization. As you rest here in the quiet darkness, let your mind drift across the vast tapestry of his achievements and failures, his triumphs and tragedies, his dreams and their inevitable dissolution. From the sun-baked streets of Corsica to the frozen steppes of Russia, from the pyramids of Egypt to the rain-soaked fields of Waterloo, from the throne of France to the volcanic shores of St. Helena, we have followed one man's incredible journey through an age of revolution and transformation. Napoleon was many things: general and emperor, lawgiver and conqueror, visionary and despot, dreamer and pragmatist. But perhaps above all, he was the embodiment of human possibility, the proof that extraordinary individuals can indeed bend history to their will, at least for a time. His legacy lives on in the laws that govern modern nations, in the ideals of equality and merit that shape our societies, in the very concept of nationalism that continues to influence world affairs. But more than that, he remains a testament to the power of human ambition, the capacity of mortal beings to dream dreams larger than themselves and to pursue those dreams with unwavering determination. As you drift towards sleep, let your thoughts settle on this truth, that in every human heart burns a spark of the same fire that drove Napoleon from Corsican boyhood to imperial grandeur. The circumstances of our lives may be different, the stages on which we perform may be smaller, but the fundamental human capacity for greatness remains unchanged. Close your eyes now and let the story of the emperor fade into the larger dream of human possibility. In the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, remember that history is not just the story of what has been, but the inspiration for what might yet be. The boy from Corsica believed that nothing was impossible for those bold enough to attempt it. In that belief, perhaps, lies the eternal lesson of his extraordinary life. Sleep well and dream of greatness.